Sex or the saw? Sex is, well, nobody knows. But the saw is family.
Hello. My name is John, and I plan to be your one-stop shop for action movies, comic book movies, and on days like today, horror movie reviews and rankings. And today, we're talking about a movie that I am very excited to talk about. And it's one of my favorite movies to talk about, one of my favorite movies to discuss. It's one of my top 3, maybe even my favorite horror movie of all time, and I might be the only person on the planet that thinks that about this movie. But this is my favorite This is my favorite horror franchise, and this is kind of a review type. I don't know if I want to say review series, but I kind of want to do kind of these underappreciated movies in my mind. You know, they might have a bad Rotten Tomatoes score, but I think they're great. They might not be the most well-received movies even in their fan bases, but I think they're great. I have another one that I plan on doing towards the end of the month that is a part of a franchise that is basically that shares a name with a holiday that happens at the end of this month. So kind of stay tuned for that. But I guess let's get started by talking about this movie, and that is 1986's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. Yep, part 2, not the first one. And it's directed by Tobe Hooper, the same director as the first movie. And don't get me wrong, I love the first movie as well. It's a classic as well. But this second movie is just a balls-to-the-walls horror black comedy masterpiece, in my opinion. It's a maniacally insane film, and I love it because of those reasons. I just love how insane and maniacal it is. And so I guess let's just start. I'll talk about the acting and the characters. And the first one you have to bring up when talking about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2 is Bill Moseley's Chop Top. He's my favorite character in the entire franchise. You know, a lot of people think Leatherface is of the face. He's usually the face of this franchise, but I don't like these movies because of Leatherface. I don't tune into these movies because of Leatherface. I tune into these movies for the family dynamic and the craziness of the Sawyer, or in the remake and the beginnings, they're called the Hewitts. But I tune in for the family, the cannibalistic family, and that's the part that terrifies me. Like, not necessarily terrifies me, but those are the elements of the horror that I think work best, not just having Leatherface running around, which is one of my biggest issues with a couple of the 2 later films. But so I mean, like, Chop Top, I guess, is my favorite family member within this entire franchise. And I think Bill Moseley does such a great job going from just being a comedic character in this black comedy to even portraying a great, insane person that you would feel so uncomfortable being around, like his presence and being in his presence. And I just think he does a great job with that.
Bubba's got a girlfriend, Bubba's got a girlfriend, Bubba's got a girlfriend, Bubba's got a girlfriend.
And also with Jim Siedow, I do think him as Drayton was a little better in the first movie, but he's still great in this movie. And stuff they do with his character, like at the beginning when they're in the chili cook-off, I just love the little spice that they put in this movie where he's a food truck caterer that just basically going around feeding these people human meat without them knowing. And it just adds like this horrific sense to the film for that reason, even though it does kind of go at it at a more comedic sense. But it's just one of those things that adds to the horrific nature of this film and even of the franchise. And so there's that. And then obviously you got to talk about Leatherface in a Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. And Bill Johnson does give one of my favorite, not my favorite, but one of my favorite Leatherface performances. And the characterization of Leatherface, I think this one gets overlooked sometimes because some people prefer the more, like, I guess, jacked version of him that you get in like the remake and the beginning. And don't get me wrong, I love that version of Leatherface. But I do love this one as well. But like I said, it's not necessarily my favorite version. But I love the way he's used. And I love the mask in this movie as well. But I love the way he's used. And like I said, people criticize him that he's not as much of a physical threat in this movie as he is in in some of his other movies. But like I said earlier, Leatherface is really only a physical threat in this franchise. That's all he provides, really. For me, the threatening and horror aspects of this franchise come from the family and the cannibalistic nature of the family, and not just the physical threat of Leatherface chasing you with a chainsaw, which, don't get me wrong, that's obviously a great part of it. But this film utilizes because Leatherface does have a childlike brain, and I think this installment uses that pretty well. And I guess let's move on to the good characters in this movie. The previous ones I talked about are good characters, but they're good bad characters. They're the villains, basically. But let's talk about Lefty and Stretch, Dennis Hopper and Caroline Williams characters. I've heard that people criticize this film a little bit about character development. And I disagree with that, although I use a makeshift term to describe it as reverse development. But so I guess let's just talk about that. Like Lefty at the beginning of the film, he's the uncle of Sally, who is the final girl, Madeline Burns' character in the first movie. And also the uncle of Franklin, who is the kid in the wheelchair in the first movie as well. And he starts off the film as a former Texas Ranger looking to avenge the victims of his niece and nephew. And throughout the events of the film, as they play out, you can see him, especially within like that scene where he's purchasing chainsaws, you see him slowly like going more and becoming less and less sane. And then by the end of the movie, he's just basically running around Battleland, this amusement park where the Sawyers operate out of. He's just running around there destroying it with chainsaws, laughing maniacally, saying random things.
I'm the Lord of the Harvest.
Who's that? Some new health food bunch?
By the end of the movie, he starts out the movie as this like heroic ranger looking to avenge his niece and nephew, but by the end of it, he's just a crazed lunatic. And I think, and there's kind of like reverse development in a sense, and that's one of the reasons I love it. And you also get that with Stretch's character. At the beginning of the film, she's just a radio DJ, and in scenes like the one where she's in the hotel with Lefty, showing him the tape, she like talks about how she's tired of just playing the same songs over and over again on the radio, gets the same calls and stuff all the time. And then you also see that her kind of manager, LG, he's kind of an incompetent-ish type of man, kind of does he says some creepy lines here and there towards her, stuff like that. And then, so you get all of that stuff about her, where she's kind of developed in a sense there at the beginning, but then just like Lefty, the events of the film make her lose her mind more and more, and by the end of the film, she's just a crazed lunatic on top of this like mountain in Battleland, waving a chainsaw around, screaming maniacally. And so you see that kind of what I call reverse development from her character, starting out as somewhat developed and then just losing her mind to where she's not developed at the end, if that makes any sense. I might not be describing it the best way, But it's basically that this film just shows, I think, how Lefty and Stretch just descend into madness by the because of the actions of the Sawyer family. And that's one of the reasons I love this film so much. And then another thing about this film is the visuals. Much like the first movie has a lot of iconic camera angles and iconic shots. And I think this movie, the visuals are just as good from a camera work standpoint. But one thing about this movie that separates itself from the first movie, in my opinion, is the production design. I love the look of the radio station, particularly in the scene where you get introduced to Chop Top. And then when you have Leatherface chasing the Stretch around the radio station and stuff. I love the design of the radio station, but most importantly, when it comes to the production design, I love the look of Battlefield and Battleland. I might have said Battlefield previously, but it's Battleland. And then I just love the look of it. It's one of my all-time favorite set designs. I love how it's like this cave and they have all these, and I love the way the skeletons and they have like these Christmas lights and all of that set up. I love the look of Battleland, this amusement park where the Sawyers operate out of. And I love how you climb up the thing, like at the end when Stretch and Chop Top are climbing up the staircase to the mountain and stuff. I love all of that, and that kind of transitions into the sound segment of the review. I think the score is a pretty underrated score. I don't necessarily think it's one of the strongest aspects of this movie in particular, but I do think overall the score is really good and pretty underrated. But I think one of the aspects where the score is really good is the very end of the movie when Chop Top is chasing Stretch up like this staircase that leads up to this mountain aspect where the grandmother is like sitting in this throne, the dead corpse of the Sawyer grandmother. And they're climbing up that mountain. I love how the score just kind of like starts blaring up and everything. I just love that aspect of the score, and I love the score in that moment and how it's used. I love it. I don't really have, and moving on, I guess, to overall opinions, like you can see, I don't really have any negatives with this movie. I think this movie is criminally underrated and underappreciated. It's one of my all-time favorite horror movies of all time. I said all time twice in that sentence. Oh well. And it might be the single most underrated film of all time, in my opinion. And it's just a balls to the walls horror, black comedy masterpiece. And there's something I forgot to mention. Some people might criticize some of the acting or performances, but I think this movie, their performances that if you put them in a very serious movie like The Dark Knight or The Godfather, they'd be god-awful performances. But if you put them in a black comedy with this tone, their performances just fit so perfectly within a movie of this tone and what this movie's going for. I think the performances work perfectly with that. And so I guess let's get back to overall. Like I said, it's a balls to the walls horror black comedy masterpiece. And honestly, I think this is deserving. It's my first time giving a score of this caliber on my channel, but I think it's deserving of an APAP score, and as perfect as possible, because there's no such thing as a perfect movie. 5 out of 5. Thanks for watching my video. If you've seen the Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, if you loved it as much as I did, if you hated it, if you just thought it was in the middle, whatever your thoughts, I'd love to hear them in the comments down below. And if you loved this video, if you liked it, if you just like me, my hands are all over the place, go ahead and smash that thumbs up button. Or maybe click that subscribe button if you want a one-stop shop for action movies, comic book movies, and on days like today, horror movie reviews and rankings. I plan to do quite a few horror movie videos. this month of October. And then always remember and never forget that the Saw is family.